Okay, so we're going to get started today. You got two different handouts, and one is exercise 104, which is obviously what we're going to work on today in class. And the second is your first actual assignment for the class. Remember, an assignment is different than an exercise. Exercise is due at the end of today. Assignment is due later on. The assignment is graded not just on a pass, not pass basis. You get an actual grade on it. All of your assignments collectively together are worth 40% of your overall grade, which means that individually they're about 6% of your grade. Okay? This particular one is your best photograph. And so what I'm looking for here is for you to shoot a photo. That photo should have been taken from the start of the semester forward. So you can't go to something that you shot over winter break. So it has to be something current. We're going to take that photo. Chances are there's going to be some post-processing necessary on that particular photo. We're going to talk through post-processing today. You're going to try to make it your best photo possible, which means you're going to adjust things like levels and curves and that sort of thing. We'll talk through that today. You'll adjust cropping of your particular image so that it's set up right, the composition is set up right, etc. So you're going to do all of those things. And 1 week from today, on the 8th of February, so that's next Wednesday, before class, you're going to post that new image, right, your best image, along with the original, because chances are you had an original and then you had some post-processing on it. And you're going to write a little paragraph that says what you did in Photoshop in terms of what post-processing you did. You're going to post that to the course website before I start talking on a week from today, on Wednesday the 8th. That make sense? Okay. You are also going to print that image. It won't look that great, but you're going to print it in color on the school printer, which is the C5550, which is across the way. You will print it in color and hand it to me on an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper. Don't crop it, just give me that. I do this for all the assignments. I ask for paper records just in case something were to happen and the website crashed or whatever, so that I have a record of what your photo was. Does that make sense? Okay, so it's just backup. So you won't get it back. It has nothing to do with your grade. I'm not even going to grade the paper versions. I'm going to grade the online versions. But I like you to at least turn in a paper version so we have a paper trail. Okay? Does that make sense? Cost you 25 cents. Not that big a deal. All right? So that's assignment 101. Obviously, read through it. If you have questions about it, let me know, and we'll go through it. I think it's pretty self-explanatory. Today we have exercise 104, which is your first entry into the world of Photoshop. I'm going to walk you through a set of scripted things. You're going to repeat those things 3 times, and I think you'll get a pretty good sense for some of the basic image processing techniques that are in Photoshop. So today's lecture will be split. I'll talk first conceptually about processing photographs and developing a digital workflow, and then after I talk with that, we'll sit down on the computer and I'll walk through Photoshop, do the steps live, and you can follow along at that point. Okay? So we'll take a brief break in between those two discussions, and then we'll continue on with the lab. So first off, what is a digital workflow? And a digital workflow, let's say that I was a wedding photographer. I was some kind of semi-pro photographer. Typically what happens is you go out to the site and you shoot your photos, and then you have to do some post-processing stuff to them to make them look better. Okay? So the term workflow is just referring to this set of steps that you typically have to go through from shooting the image to the final production, whatever that might be. Depending on who you are as a photographer, these steps are going to be different. And so you have to figure out what it is that is your workflow and what are the typical changes that need to happen. So obviously, in terms of the key components of a workflow, we have to start somewhere, and that is you have to go take the photos. And so you go out to a site, you take those particular photos. If you're a wedding photographer, you take wedding photos. If you're an archaeologist, you might take archaeology photos. Whatever it is, right? Let's say that you're an architecture student in 220 or 221. You go out to your potential site that you're going to design a building on, and you take photos of that site. That might be the initiation of this process. Okay? Then we move on into the next step, which would be to get the images from whatever you took them on, your phone, your digital camera, whatever it is, into your computer. Once you have them into your computer, then they're going to go into some kind of a software package maybe. Maybe they're going to go online. Maybe you're just going to do something on Instagram and post it and run a quick filter or something like that. Maybe you open up Snapchat and you do some things there. Whatever that is, that would be the post-processing part of this. Okay? Next, you're going to do this post-processing. Obviously, today I'm going to try to concentrate on high-quality post-processing, right, as opposed to the Snapchat add a little, weird, creepy face on your face or something like that, which would also be post-processing. We're not going to focus on that just now. We're going to try to do some high-quality post-processing in Photoshop today. And then we're finally going to output our images, and that might be posting them on Facebook, it might be putting them on Instagram, it might be putting them on a web album, it might be printing them. I know paper is like an old school thing, but you might actually want printed photographs. So you're going to think about what that final output should be, and ultimately that's going to drive this workflow. Okay? Chances are you already have some kind of a workflow, right? You take the picture and then you do something with it. I took the picture, I post it to Facebook. Well, that in its simplest term is actually a workflow. Okay? Hopefully we're going to evolve that a little bit, make your photos a little bit better, and that's certainly part of it. The other thing that you learn as you take more and more photos is that there are certain things that you almost always have to do to make your images better. For me personally, I almost always have to do a levels adjustment. That's just like standard operating procedure. I just have to do that. Okay? You'll learn, is that something that's common for you or not? Okay? Is there any step that you can automate? A lot of software will automatically do certain things. If you can do it automatically, great. It saves you a little bit of time. Right? And then how will your photos be used ultimately? That just has to do with what size should they be. If you post something to Instagram and it's a little tiny photo and you want to go blow it up and print it on your wall, it's probably not going to work. So you have to think about the overall size. Then we move into what software am I going to use? And it's actually kind of interesting because this particular thing has evolved dramatically in the last 10 years. What software you use is really becoming less and less important because we rely more on just web apps and our phones to deal with the processing. So in the old days, we had to have a really fancy image processor. And we're doing much less of that. Obviously, we're going to use the workhorse today in Photoshop, but that's kind of a one-off selective thing. You're not going to do it to every one of your particular photos. So let's talk about some of the options. Okay, we'll start with some free options. The first one is Google's Photos. It's just called Google Photos. It used to be called Picasa, but they changed it. It's free, comes with your Google account. A lot of you have Gmail anyway, so you have Google Photos. It's easy to use, right? It's kind of like Instagram. There's a bunch of presets. You can click on them. If we go back for a second here, you can see on the right side there's a bunch of presets. You can take your image. You can make it look a little bit different. Okay? Really, there aren't too many sophisticated changes that you can make. You're not going to see any histograms. You're not going to do levels adjustments, any of that kind of stuff. But it's pretty easy to work with. You can make a web album. You can share it with somebody. They can see your photos. It's OK, right? There's not very many advanced editing features, like I said. Nothing fancy there. You obviously have to have a connection to the internet somehow to see it. It can, and I use semi-destructive as kind of a loose term. Whenever you use one of these online services to manage your photos and or to edit your photos, you run into the trouble of you're relying on the company or the server to keep your original photo and the edited version of your photo, and are they going to throw out your original and just keep the edited version? You're kind of stuck in terms of what are they going to do. You don't have control anymore. You upload it to the service, they have control. So I use semi-destructive here because the changes you make may become permanent if they get rid of your original file. If they decide to stop letting you reverse your changes, it's really dependent on the company. So be aware of that. Okay? We move into Adobe Photoshop Express. To me, the Adobe mindset is a little wacky here because they use Photoshop so loosely in a variety of ways. We have true Photoshop on the computer. Then we have this Photoshop Express thing, sort of. It kind of is their syncing thing, but it kind of works with Lightroom. I don't know. The whole naming convention is really confusing, but this is very much like the Google Photos thing. You upload your photos into the service, and they provide some basic editing features, right? It is, again, pretty easy to use, easy to get your prints, share your prints, etc. It is free, which is nice. It does have a few more advanced editing features built into it, which is not a bad thing, and can certainly give you some options for free. You obviously have to have a connection to the internet, but it is a destructive editor. So once you change your photo and save your photo, that's now the photo. You can't go back to your original. So it's not reversible, and that's something to be aware of. The other thing is it requires Flash Player, which is fine if you're on a computer, but if you're on any kind of you want to browse mobily on your tablet or whatever, they're not going to support Flash, so you're kind of stuck, right? So it's certainly something to be aware of. Next one is a company called Pixlr.com, and they started in the era of dropping vowels out of words, so it's Pixlr.com, and they actually have a online photo editor that is shockingly similar to Photoshop. It's almost exactly Photoshop, but online and for free. So it's kind of cool. Okay? It does have things like layers. It has a lot of advanced features. Really worth a look for a free version of what we're doing. Obviously, you guys have the true version of Photoshop in the lab, so that's what we're going to learn in this class. But there is a online kind of free version, which is kind of cool. You can save your files back to your flash drive. Then it's on you to keep the original and the edited version. So you have to be a little aware of that. Okay? It obviously requires an internet connection, advanced editing features, including layers. It is a destructive editor in that once you save your changes, you can't go back. Okay? And it does, again, require flash, so you're kind of stuck to having to do it on your computer itself. Photos is the Apple evolution of a photo management app. It works really nicely if you play within the Apple ecosystem. So if you have a Mac, you have an iPad, you have an iPhone, life is pretty good. If you suddenly throw Windows in there, it gets a little wonky. So if you're in the Apple ecosystem, it's a nice option. It's free. It has fairly advanced editing features, which is good. I was a big fan of Apple's professional photo management application, which was called Aperture. I spent a lot of time in my Aperture libraries. I really liked them, and then Apple pulled the plug on it in 2014. So I was kind of distraught at that point because a lot of the stuff that I'd worked on went away. In retrospect, I probably should have used Lightroom from the beginning, but such is life. This is here. It's free. It comes with any Mac that you have. It's great because it has non-destructive editing of images. That means your edits or whatever changes you apply happen on layers on top of the original image. You can always go back and turn off those changes, which is good. It does have some very advanced editing features built in, which is great. Includes dodging and burning, histograms. A lot of the stuff that we'll do in Photoshop is built in, which is good. It does also include extensive metadata support. We'll talk about what metadata is and why it's important in a little bit. And of course, you have organizational strategies in terms of facial recognition and stuff built into the software that helps you organize your particular photos. It is, of course, Mac only. And it is one of their ways of getting you to buy into an iCloud subscription because they want you to upload your photos. And I'll tell you what, the free 5 gigs that they give you doesn't go very far when you start uploading photos. So it is kind of a way of them getting more money out of you. So you want to be aware of that as well. So in terms of professional options, really Adobe is the only maker of professional options at this point. Apple used to compete with their Aperture product, but they've gotten rid of it. So Adobe has 2 professional primary products. One is called Lightroom. The other is called Photoshop. Okay? In this class, we'll deal with Photoshop, but we won't deal with Lightroom. The fundamental difference here is that Lightroom is all about organization and keeping track of your photos and kind of managing your photo library. Photoshop is about an individual image, editing that individual image. Right? So they're a little bit different, but they kind of overlap to some extent. So Lightroom is expensive. Right? You're either paying outright for the software or you're paying a monthly subscription as part of your Creative Cloud license, which as a student is relatively cheap, but when you graduate starts to get really expensive. Right? It does include some very advanced editing features built into it, so you don't have to go into Photoshop. You can do some of the advanced editing within the Lightroom program itself. Again, extensive metadata support, which we'll talk about in a second. And of course, you have all the same ways of organizing your files. Then we move into the world of Photoshop. And Photoshop is, of course, the gold standard in photo editing. You can do pixel by pixel changes on a particular image. It's very, very good. It's non-destructive, assuming you save a Photoshop file format, not a save for web, JPEG, or something like that. As long as you save Photoshop itself, you can go back an infinite number of times. Right? It is the most advanced in terms of any software option in terms of what you can do. It's, of course, great for collages and things where you bring multiple images together, and we will, of course, go through that in this class. You can do layer-based work, so you can have multiple layers. You can control how those layers apply to other layers. There is no, this is kind of the fundamental difference between Photoshop and Lightroom. There is no album support, so you can't organize your photos in any way. It's one image, edit that image, save it. And nothing more than that. So it is specific to one image. So in terms of organizing your images, what kind of stuff is out there for us? And again, we rely a lot more online to organize our images than we used to on the computer. So you used to have a software program on your computer, kind of like iPhoto or Google Picasa or something like that, that would do this organization. Now most of the time we just upload it online and have it up there. Right? That's kind of the way it works, and things change. I told you I'd talk about what metadata is, and I think this is something that's really critical as part of a digital photograph, and that is that within the photograph file itself, within the digital file, it includes a bunch of extra information. So if you guys remember back, you might have had like an aunt that likes to take pictures way back when it was a film camera, and her film camera put that little orange date in the corner. You remember that a little bit? Right? It's probably like a great aunt or something to you, right? Because they really got into this and they wanted the little date showing up in their corner, so they knew what date the photo was taken, etc. That digital equivalent is contained with any file you shoot now with a digital camera. You can't see it unless you have some kind of an application that can read this metadata or extra data. But basically what happens is when you take an image, it records almost everything about that particular image. So in this case, this is just a metadata shot of an image that I took. We could see right here that it was shot with a Nikon D80. It tells me exactly what the lens was. And then here's a bunch of information that we talked about last class. So the ISO of this was 125. The lens length was a 62 millimeter. That was what telephoto I had dialed in when I shot this. The aperture was a 5.6, right? And the shutter speed right there was 1/500th of a second. So the digital file, the photograph, contains that information for me. It also down here shows me what date and what time exactly to the second I shot the photo. Right? It contains other information like, what size the image was in pixels, etc. When you shoot in your phone or something that has GPS enabled, right? You probably remember when you first got your phone brand new and you opened your camera, it said, "Would you like to allow location services on your camera?" And everybody says, "Yeah, whatever." Right? Well, what that means is it takes the GPS location of where you shot the photo and tags it into the metadata. So now where you shot the photo is relevant. So all that information gets contained within this metadata support. When we move into organizing our photos, this has evolved quite a bit. Albums were the first organizational strategy. The idea here was much like an old school photo album that sat on a shelf. It was like a binder of your photos. Oh, all the shots from Hawaii are going to go into this album. Right? This was my vacation trip or whatever. It seemed like a very natural way of doing it. Okay? As we move forward from that, right, companies got smart and they said, well, wait a minute. Generally speaking, you don't shoot an even number of pictures all the time. Right? You don't shoot one picture every 30 minutes all your life. It works like I'm at a birthday party, I take 100 photos. Then I don't take any photos for a couple days, and then I take another set of photos doing something else. Right? I'm at school and I take a group of photos. So the software got sophisticated enough to say these groups, chances are, correspond to a specific thing that was going on, a specific event, right? Because we have groups of photos. So all you do is you name this is a particular event, and now, like an album, the computer's determined this is the group of photos that go together. So you don't manually have to go say this is the birthday party. It just automatically knows this group goes together. Can you provide a name for me? Oh, it's a birthday party. Okay? So it's pretty easy. You can also specify a particular time frame if it's not being accurate enough, but chances are it's fairly accurate in terms of its grouping. Facial recognition. We're now at a point where facial recognition is very common. We had kind of a slow rollout of this as a feature set. Obviously, governmental agencies, police agencies, etc., have had facial recognition for a long time. Okay? It was a little creepy when we first started to get it in our day-to-day life. right? Now we're starting to get used to it, right? You know that when you post an image on Facebook, it looks through your friends and automatically tags who's in the photos and that sort of thing. This facial recognition is now extraordinarily popular, and it's really built into a lot of things, right? It's also fast enough to do it really quickly. So be aware that this kind of stuff exists, and obviously it can recognize who's in a particular photo and group those photos together. Again, automated process, so you don't have to go through and manually say, this person is this person. We talked about places before. If you shoot with your phone or something that has a GPS chip in it, it automatically tags where you shot the image, which means you can geographically say, here's where all my images were shot. Okay, which is another way of organizing. Again, something that's automatic as part of this. So let's move into the typical adjustments from organizational strategies into the traditional adjustments that are going to happen. And I'll talk through these, and we'll do these live in Photoshop. So the first thing that we talked about was, last class, was composition. So a typical adjustment would be composition, right? I shot the image. It didn't really turn out the way I wanted. It wasn't quite lined up the way I wanted. So after the fact, let me go in and let me crop the image based on the principles of composition that I wanted. Okay? So we'll go back and we'll crop the image down, and this then becomes the image. Right? Maybe it's something like this. This is obviously Photoshop. Notice that when we try to do a Photoshop crop up here at the top, right here we could specify rule of thirds. Remember, that was a compositional technique that we talked about last class. And lo and behold, the crop area window here is divided up into our rule of thirds. And now we can compose our image so that the person lines up on that rule of thirds line. Okay, so this is built into Photoshop. It makes your life easy. Right? Another example here, again, rule of thirds shows up. And we can use that. This is a square composition. Right? I just love this image. I would like to work here. This sounds awesome. Okay? Now, having a Wi-Fi signal might be a little challenging. But anyway, the point is, again, rule of thirds. And we adjust that composition based on what the overall image was. Then we get into exposure. Right? So maybe you made a mistake when you shot the original image and it wasn't exposed correctly. It was underexposed or overexposed. If you use a raw image, you can go back and manually adjust this after the fact. So I made a mistake. Let me lighten up the image. Let me darken the image. Right? It's generally easy to lighten dark images, and it's generally hard to darken light images. If you have a raw file, you can go both ways. If you have a JPEG file, it's much, much harder to take something that's washed out in too light and bring it back. Right? So let's see an example. Right? We have the image on the left that's just too dark. The exposure wasn't quite right. We adjust the exposure. You can see all the detail in the photo. Right? So we make that exposure adjustment after the fact. Brightness and contrast is a really heavy-handed way of adjusting an image. On the surface level, it's pretty easy to do. It's just a couple sliders, but it's hard to get really good results. And we're going to deal with levels adjustments, vibrancy adjustments, some of the other style adjustments, and they're a little bit better. But basically what it's doing is it's making the image have stronger darks and lights. Right? So going from something that's rather gray here to something that punches out the detail. So we have whiter whites, darker darks. But again, it's fairly heavy-handed. Then we get into color, saturation, or vibrance adjustments. So this would be, I had an improper white balance, and I want to shift the photo from being too blue to being more in the orange spectrum. That might be a strategy. Maybe you want to tint the image to a specific color. You want to tint something in the image. Right? Maybe you want to add more or less saturation or vibrance to the image, just to make the colors pop a little bit more. Right? So here's an example here of saturation versus vibrance. Right? Saturation pushes out the bolder colors. So we see here in the book, the red book really stands out. It's a high saturation color. Vibrance, on the other hand, adjusts the lower saturation colors up without pushing the higher saturation colors too high. Right? So it ends up being a slightly better result. But you can see them side by side here in terms of what they do. And we'll again talk about it. Maybe we want to convert an image to black and white or a sepia tone. Sepia would be brown instead of black and white. Maybe we want to convert the image that way. And it's really a much better strategy to do these conversions to black and white or sepia in Photoshop than to actually shoot in black and white. Right? In the old days, you got black and white film, and that's how you shot your image, and you were stuck with black and white. Now we shoot in color, and we convert to black and white. And you can do a bunch of different conversion processes that change how the black and white or sepia tone image actually looks. And we'll go through that today as part of our exercise. Another example here, color to black and white. We might need to make some focus adjustments. You can't go back in time. Let's say you shot an image and it was blurry. Okay, you can't go back in time and say, wait a minute, I didn't want it to be blurry. Let me make it actually focused. Okay, it doesn't quite work like that. But we can adjust subtle changes or subtle sharpness of a particular image. I'll show you an example next that kind of changes the texture of an image. You might also do the opposite. You might want to blur out the background. You might want to have a little bit more blur on it to soften the image. Right? That's another option. So let's look at an example here. Right? It's hard to tell on the projector. The example on the left is the original image. This has a slight sharpening filter or an unsharp mask put on it, and you can see a little bit more detail right here in the pages, the edges of the pages. So it's very subtle, but it can enhance the image a little bit. Okay? Red eye reduction. Anybody had red eye in photos before? Right? Happens. Not a big surprise. Right? So we can go in and correct that. And some software packages are automatic. In Photoshop, we could do a clone stamp and make that go away rather easily. Anybody know why red eye happens? No? Okay. So typically, red eye happens when you use a flash and the room is dark. Okay, so let's imagine we're standing in a dark room. Okay, what do our eyes do? We need to see, so our pupils dilate, correct? Yeah, so our pupils are really big. Then suddenly, somebody wants to take a picture, they flash a flash directly at you, and the light goes into your eye because your pupil's really big, and it bounces off the back of your eye and comes back out. Okay, the camera captures that reflection, which is what you're getting right there, the red eye. It's the reflection. So we came up with red eye reduction flashes or things that are just built in. Now most phones, cameras, and stuff do this automatically. What do? They put a flash out before they actually take the picture. What happens when that flash happens to your eyes? Pupils constrict, right? It's not wide open anymore. It's kind of like aperture on a camera. They're constricted. The likelihood of you getting that reflection goes down. The other solution for this is to separate where your flash is and where your lens is. So everybody been to a wedding before? I'm guessing most people have been to a wedding. Okay? The wedding photographer that's running around doesn't use a point and shoot camera, right? They use the big bulky SLR and they have the big flash sitting up over here and it's shooting and reflecting, and right? And you're like, oh, well, they must be professionals. Well, the reason they do that with the flash, right, is they're reflecting the light so that the light isn't coming directly into your eyes and coming back. Right? If the light's coming from over here and the camera's over here, the chances of the light coming in, reflecting perfectly to give red eye is very slim. Okay? So they separate the flash from the camera lens. We have a distinct problem when we look at our phones and we have the camera lens and we have the flash right next to it. Right? They're very, very close together. So that's the opposite. So we're far more likely to have red eye in that context. Right? So it's something to be aware of. Of course, afterward in Photoshop, we can post-process and it's fine. It goes away. So then we move into some of the more advanced editing. And we're going to cover these extensively today. The first one is called a levels adjustment. And I said when I was talking about my initial typical steps that I do when I'm shooting, a levels adjustment I almost always have to do. And what levels does is levels adjusts where black is in the image and where white is in the image. And I'll show you an example in just a second, and then we'll flip back to this graph. Oops, sorry, wrong direction. Okay? So here we have two images side by side. Okay? It's the same image. One has had a levels adjustment. So if we look for just a second at this image on the left, okay, and we try to pick out in this image where is true black. right? Well, it's probably maybe like right in there somewhere in that shadow. Okay, that's as black as we can get, but it's really a dark gray. Right? It's not really black. And then if we looked at the same image and we said, okay, well, we need some white. What is true white? Well, maybe it's that right there. Maybe it's that little dot. Maybe it's this little piece, something like that. That's really not true white. It's kind of a light gray. So in this original image right here, we have a light gray and a dark gray. We don't have black and we don't have white. And so what a levels adjustment is it says, okay, the place that is black or dark gray right there should really be black, like true black. And the thing that is white here should probably be true white. And so if we look, I'm going to go back a slide, maybe not quite that far. If we look right here, this graph is called a histogram. And that histogram shows us the distribution of pixels at a certain black or white value. Okay, so if we were to take the image and we were to count the number of pixels that were a particular shade of gray, right, and then plot it on this graph, we'd say, okay, well, somewhere right about here, neutral gray, that's where we have most of the pixels. So we'd plot them all here, right, and they'd all be there. Then we go to either side and we start counting the number of pixels. And at some point we get to that light gray that was white in the first image, and we get to that dark gray that was supposed to be black. Make sense? And so we get this graph that starts about here and goes up, whoops, right, that goes like that. So what we do is we say, okay, well, instead of having pure white right here at the end of the graph, we're going to pull that back in to where we want pure white to be. Likewise, what would be black, we're going to pull in to right there. And you guys will do this live and it'll suddenly make sense, but I at least wanted to try to talk through it. Okay? So we pinch that in and we say this is now true white, this is now true black, and we have a much better looking image as a whole. Right? So we transform from this image into that image. Okay? And you guys will all do this today. Then we get into curves. And curves is probably the hardest thing to explain verbally without having you actually do it. Okay? The idea here is that you can selectively adjust parts of the image without changing other parts of the image. Sounds pretty generic. When you all sit down and we do this as part of your exercise, it will suddenly make sense. Okay? But for example, you could take an image that looks like this and turn it into an image that's on the right. Okay? Just based on a curves adjustment. Here's another example here. Image on the left becomes the image on the right. The curves adjustment is shown in terms of what we adjusted. And I'll explain how this all works when we do the live example. Right? It's much easier than trying to verbally explain it. Then we get to the final results page. And that is, are we going to print it? Are we going to publish it to the course website? Are we going to put it on Facebook or what? So we do all this post-processing so we have this ideal perfect image, and then we have to put it somewhere. Okay? And that ends up being the final process. Maybe we're going to put it on Instagram, Flickr, etc. Or maybe we're going to put it on the course website, or maybe we're going to send it and have it printed somewhere. Okay? Much less common now than it used to be. Okay? So we're going to stop here. I'll give you, let's do like a 5-minute break. Right? Then we'll start up again, and I'll sit down and we'll go through the whole Photoshop thing. During the break, let's go a little longer. Let's go 10 minutes. During that break, make sure that you pick 3 images from the images that you worked with, right, or that you shot last class. I ask you to pick those 3 images. Okay? We're going to be working with those 3 images. If you shot with them on your phone, email them to yourself or plug in your camera. Get them onto your flash drive. Okay? If you shot with an actual digital camera, take your card, stick it in, and copy 3 of those images. We're going to work with 3 images today. It doesn't matter what 3 images you pick. Part of the reason I have you pick 3 different images is because some of them will have a levels adjustment, some of them won't. Some of them will have a curves adjustment, some of them won't. So we're going to run through all of these typical adjustments, and you'll learn which ones are appropriate. Does that make sense? All right, so we'll come back at 5 till. Okay, so we're going to pick up and get started again with exercise 104. And as part of exercise 104, it's really about practice. And so I asked for 3 different images. We're going to run through 6 different steps with 3 of those images. And so you're going to end up with like 18 images that you'll post today. So it's a lot of images, but you will learn by working with different photos kind of what adjustments are appropriate to various photos. So I've opened up 3 photos in Photoshop, and I'm going to go through those to start. But I want to talk through Photoshop to begin with. And how many people have worked in Photoshop before? Right? Of the Adobe suite, Photoshop's kind of the most common. So I would expect that out of you. But I still like to go through kind of the general graphic user interface and talk about what Photoshop is and what's available where. And so in Photoshop and really in a lot of the Adobe suite, most of the applications look similar, and they're set up in a similar way. At the top of the page here, we have our traditional menu structure. A lot of the commands are available via the menu structure. So at certain points, I will point to a particular menu, and you'll do that. Below that is a contextual ribbon that changes based on what tool you have selected. And this is the same in all the Adobe products. And that is if, for example, I pick the clone stamp tool, the contextual menu is going to change, and that's going to be different than, say, the crop contextual menu. And so as I pick different options, this ribbon changes based on what the options are. So as you have a tool selected, you want to look up here and see what options are available from that particular tool. Okay? And so be aware of that. On the left side here, we have a bunch of our most common tools. Depending on which computer you're working on, or if you have it set up a little bit different at home, etc., you may have a double row of tools instead of a single row of tools. I believe the default on these computers is like mine and has a single row of tools. It's important to recognize, though, underneath any one of these tools, there's a little arrow. If you click and hold, you'll get other options. Okay? And that is pretty much for all of them. So even for the crop tool, for example, there's other options. For the selection tool, there's other options. The move tool will be the one that doesn't have any other options. Okay? So just be aware that those exist and that you will probably be using options that are hidden underneath other tools. And I'll be sure to tell you as we go along. On the right side, we have our traditional kind of color and swatches palette, and then below that is our layers palette. And this should be by default. If you're not seeing this, right by the X at the top corner, there's something called Essentials. It probably says Essentials for you. That is a workspace in Adobe Photoshop. And you can see that we can change, for example, if we wanted to be in the photography workspace, we can switch, we get photography, and we'd see different tools or windows available to us, or panels, whatever you want to call them, on the right side here. Generally speaking, I leave it in Essentials so that we just have the default, and it's not a big deal. Though today, because we're working in photography, if you'd like to switch to the photography workspace, that would be okay as well. It really doesn't matter too much. Okay? Any one of the tools is available via the window menu. You could turn on or off any of those things that are on the right side. So just be aware that they are there. Okay? The layers palette is not too critical today, though as you move forward in your Photoshop career, the layers are going to become really, really important. And so we'll talk through layers and kind of what goes on from there. You'll notice that when you open your first file, and we'll go ahead, and I already have one open, but you could go to File and then Open, browse for a particular image, and then go ahead and say Open, and it would open that file. When you open a file in Photoshop, the photo that you opened shows up on a layer called Background. That layer is italicized, and it has a lock next to it, which means you can't edit the image itself. And for today's exercise, that makes no difference. We're not actually editing the image. We're going to put something called an adjustment layer on top of the image. But be aware that sometimes you have to actually unlock the photo so you can do real editing on it. And we'll talk about that when it comes time. There's a few little tools down at the bottom here, including Add Layer Mask and New Layer, etc. We will cover those more extensively as we go forward in the class. Not really worth worrying about today. Okay? So I'm going to start with an image, and for lecture purposes, I'm going to flip back and forth between a bunch of images because some images work better with certain things, and you'll see them better on the screen. For your exercise, you're going to work with one image and do all the steps. Then you'll work with another image, even if the result of one of the steps really doesn't look any different. Okay? I still want you to go through the practice. So the first thing, which actually isn't indicated on your sheet, but I wanted to at least talk about it because I tend to just assume that people know how to do it. But the first thing that I wanted to talk about is the crop tool. And generally speaking, I don't talk about it, and I should. So I'm going to add that in today. When we pick the crop tool, we would click on the little crop icon, and we immediately get a rectangle with a grayed out space above and below, or maybe on all sides. And if we look at our contextual menu right here, we have some options. So the first thing is right here, the first menu, it says custom right now. Yours may or may not say that. I have some preset ratios that I can use. So for example, if I wanted ultimately to make a 5:7 print, I could choose 5:7, and it's going to keep my crop ratio at 5:7. It's going to be constrained to that ratio. I could also change and have maybe 16:9. That's a wide format, like a like movie format. I have a tendency to talk too loud, so keep that closed. So you can think about what particular format. Obviously, there's one that is square, so 1 by 1 would give us a square. Okay? Once I pick the overall crop ratio, whatever that is, I can then drag the corners to adjust what an appropriate crop would be. Right? And remember, by default, under View, it says Rule of Thirds. Right? We have some other options that are available. You could use a golden ratio, for example. To me, the Rule of Thirds is the easiest one to work with. So I leave Rule of Thirds on. And then we can adjust where this is going to fall, how large the crop is, and what looks appropriate. Okay? So let's say that I like this as an overall. I'll go ahead and commit the changes by clicking the little check mark at the top of that contextual ribbon. So I've now done that. My crop is done. If I want to see the whole image and have it fill the screen, I can press Control and 0, which will enlarge the image to fill my screen. Okay? On these screens, the images are fairly large anyway. You can also use Control plus and Control minus to zoom in and zoom out, although Control 0 is really the easiest way for right now. Okay, so I've finished my cropping, and at this point, I can move on and use one of the other tools. So for example, I could switch to the Move tool just so that nothing's currently active. Okay? Now that I have the crop done, I'm going to move on and do my first adjustment, and that is to convert an image to black and white. Now, on the course website, if you go to Tutorials, you go to Photoshop, you'll see that it matches up with your exercise. 1.1 through 1.5 right here are all written out. So everything that I'm going to talk through is written out. Furthermore, there's a little video that goes through exactly what I'm saying. Okay, so if you get a little bit lost, you can go back and see it. But there are also little images that help kind of guide you in this process. Okay, so I will refer back to these so that you can see it, though I've done it enough times to where I basically know the steps anyway. But if you get a little lost, don't forget to go back and look at these as well. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to go and convert this particular image to black and white. Now, it doesn't matter the order in which we're doing this, right? We could do black and white last after we've done the other adjustments. It's a matter of the workflow. I like to start with black and white because you can immediately see something change. Okay? So when we convert to black and white, we're going to use something called an adjustment layer. And I think one of the really powerful things in Photoshop is that when we perform these kinds of changes, we do it on a layer that can be turned on or turned off. And so it's no longer baked into the image itself. It's its own separate entity that's customizable, editable, and turn on and offable, if that's a word. Okay? And so what I'll do is I'll go up to the Layer menu. And when I have the Layer menu active, I'm going to come down to New Adjustment Layer. Okay? Once I get there, I'm going to come over, and I'm not, even though you would assume that I would pick black and white, that's actually not what I'm going to use to convert to black and white. I know, weird, right? Instead of using that, I'm going to use something called the channel mixer. Okay? And there's a reason that I'm going to use the channel mixer over the black and white. And that is that I have far more options with how this converts to black and white. Okay? So as soon as I pick channel mixer from the layer, new adjustment layer, channel mixer, I get a new layer pop-up window, or pop-up dialog here. And it says, what name do you want it to be? It's by default channel mixer 1. I'm going to change that to black and white for now, to make it clean. Okay? So I have it set for black and white. The default options here are just fine. And I'll go ahead and say OK. And once I say OK, nothing changes, okay, because I haven't actually made any changes yet. But you'll see that something called the channel mixer will pop up under the properties little window here on the right side. So you should see that come up. Okay? If for some reason it's gone, you can get back to it by double-clicking on this icon that is on your black and white layer next to the white square. So right here, if you double-click, it will come back. Okay? So once I have the channel mixer showing, I'm going to convert the image to black and white by checking the box for monochrome. Okay? And the image goes from being in color to being in black and white. Once it's in black and white, this is where using the channel mixer rather than the black and white layer can matter. And that is that there are a bunch of presets up here under the preset selection that will adjust how this image is converted to black and white. And all of these presets are designed to mimic actual filters that you would put on your camera lens if you were shooting old school with black and white film. Okay? But obviously we're not shooting in black and white film, we're just digitally adjusting the image. So what I want you to do is go through the default presets. So we'll start with the black and white infrared, and you'll see that my image changes. The sky gets lighter, right? And what is showing in black and white changes. If I switch from infrared to the blue filter, it changes even more. The sky's almost entirely washed out. So that might not be the right choice. If I move on and I say the green filter, right, I get a very different look for what this is. And you should see all of these changes on your image as well. I switch to the orange filter. Now the sky is starting to get much darker. So you see there are a variety of ways of making this a black and white image. It's not as simple as just black and white. Right? I'm choosing how the black and white is applied. So the orange looks pretty good. I'll try the red. The red looks very good. I like that look. Right? Maybe I'll come down here to the yellow. Not quite as good. It's between the orange and the red. I think the orange actually is the one I like. Okay? So the point is that I'm going through all of those presets and deciding which one looks best to my eye. So there isn't a right or wrong answer. Right? You guys each might pick a different filter, and it's dependent on your particular image. Okay? Below that, after we've done the presets, I do have the ability to manually change the red, green, and blue values. Okay? Generally speaking, you want the red, green, and blue values always to add up to 100. Okay? But generally speaking, when you're doing a black and white conversion, it's easier to work with the presets than to manually adjust these values, though you can. Okay? And I'll talk through adjusting these values a little bit later on in a different tutorial, and we'll talk through that a little bit. Okay? So now that I have this converted to black and white, right, I can go ahead and close that menu, and I do that by clicking these two arrows. It looks kind of like a fast forward button, and it just drops that window away. And I now have a black and white version of this particular image. Now one of the really neat things about this is that the black and white exists as a layer here in my layers palette. And if I click the little eye next to it, I can just turn it on or turn it off at will. Okay? So as I start to do these outputs, I'm going to end up with a stack of my original image and then all of the adjustments that I've made to it. And I can choose which ones stay on and which ones turn off. Okay? So I'm going to move on. And the next thing that I'm going to work on is a levels adjustment. So we just did this first one, Photoshop 1.1 black and white, and that walks you through it. I'm going to move on to Photoshop 1.2, which is the levels adjustment. So I have, again, the same image here, and I'm going to perform a levels adjustment on this particular image. I'm going to leave it in color for right now. So I've turned off my black and white. And again, it doesn't make any difference because I can turn it on or turn it off at will. I'm going to go up to the Layer menu. I'm going to go to New Adjustment Layer. And this time, I'm going to pick Levels. Okay, it gives me a new layer name, which is Levels 1. That's fine. I'll go ahead and say OK. Default options are just fine. And now, in the Properties window, much like I got the channel mixer last time, this time I get a levels adjustment. And on the levels adjustment here, I can see my histogram and the distribution of black and white pixels. So in this case, my histogram starts at black and ends at white. And I have values all the way at black and at white. And if the truth is, if I looked at my image, I could pick out that these shadows or this branch are very close to true black. And here in the sky and the clouds, that's very close to true white. So there's really not too much of adjustment that I can make in this levels adjustment. Okay, so in this case, really I could pinch in the black just a little bit, but it's not going to do a whole lot for me. Okay, so let me try a different image just so that you can see it. Okay, so here's another shot. And if I go to my layer, New Adjustment Layer, Levels, I'll say OK. I have a different histogram here. And part of the reason that I'm flipping between images is I want to show you the contrast. Okay? So when you're doing this exercise, you may end up like me on this first image where I go to do the levels and nothing changes. Right? Do it anyway, even though that there's no changes, because it's part of the process. And then when you try a different image, maybe it will need a levels adjustment. So in this case, in this image, it really does need a levels adjustment. So once again, I have the histogram showing here. The white value is pretty close to true white. And that's because I have this sunspot here that is very, very close to true white. So there's not much adjustment I can do on the white end. But on the black end, there's nothing in this image that really is true black. Okay? The closest would probably be right in here in one of those shadows of the footprint. So I'm going to take this triangle at the bottom, and I'm going to pull that triangle over, and I'm going to say that black actually happens right where that graph starts to go up. Okay? And you can see the transformation now. Here, it's a little bit more washed out. And when I make the levels adjustment, I have a true black in those shadows. Okay? So it's a rather dramatic change in this particular image. Let me try it again with a different image. Okay? And again, I'm flipping through images so you can see it happen. Let me go to my layer, New Adjustment Layer, Levels. There's Levels. Okay, so now I look at this histogram again, and we've got, again, strong pure white. That would be in the sun. But the black really needs to be pulled over, and I can pull that black value over like that. And so you can see that's a fairly dramatic shift in terms of the saturation of the colors and whatever. So the levels adjustment is something that is very, very common for a lot of images. Okay? I can do it one more time on this image. Let me go to Layer, New Adjustment Layer. I'll go to Levels. Say OK. And this one's pretty good on the darks, but the whites need to come back over just a bit. Okay? And so that's not too much of a change, but it brightened it up just a little bit on the edges of the pastry. Okay? So I'm showing you that it depends on the image itself. So that was the levels adjustment. Okay? And again, that's shown here. And you can see how the levels adjustment works for these images. We'll move on into curves. And curves was the thing that I said you really had to try and experiment with to understand how it was going to work. So I'm going to show you curves in a variety of images so you can start to see it happen. So we'll go again to the Layers menu. We'll go to New Adjustment Layer, and this time we'll pick Curves. And we'll call it Curves 1, and I'll say OK. So what happens is I have a little bit different looking graph than the last one. And I have a diagonal line that runs across this image. Okay? On this diagonal line, the lighter parts of the image are represented by the top of the line. The darker parts of the image are represented by the lower parts of the line. If I were to click on the line and drop the line down, right, the image is going to get darker. If I were to drop the line up, the image is going to get lighter, okay, as a whole. So we'll get it back to where it is as a start. We can see in the little write-up here that I talk about it in this image. Right? So there's my curves. Everything in the yellow here means that it's getting darker. Anything in the white means the image is getting lighter. Okay? So yes, on the surface, okay, this is rather simple. Okay, I drag it down, my image gets darker. I drag it up, my image gets lighter. Okay, I get that. The difference here is that we can control which parts of the image are dark and which parts are light. So for example, right, I'm going to leave a point right here in the center. Actually, let me just get rid of this curve for just a second and start fresh. New adjustment layer, curves. All right, so I have a fresh start. Okay? What I'll do is I'll set a point right here in the center, right in the center of the graph, and I'll just click once. That sets a point in the center. Now I'm going to click and drag the upper part of the image. So this is the lighter portion of the image. And maybe I want to make the lighter portion of the image a little bit darker. And you can see that it's adjusting the lighter portion of the image and making it darker. And at the same time, the curve is starting to bend. And I could adjust the darker part of the image and make it lighter. I'm going to exaggerate this so you can see it a little bit better. Okay? So with this curve, I've taken the image and I've said, make the lighter parts darker, make the darker parts lighter. So if we look down here in the darker section of the image, that got a lot lighter. The shadows got a lot lighter. So this may not be the most attractive thing in the world, but it's something that I could do as part of the image. And when we combine this later with masks, you'll start to see the power of what you can do. Let me do another curves adjustment and do another illustration. So let me go to Layer, New Adjustment Layer, Curves. Again, it's straight. For me, I like to pick a point in the center to fix the center value. And then instead of darkening the lights, I'm going to do a more subtle curve. It's about like that. So I bumped up the contrast a little bit. And to me, this starts to make the image a little bit better. It looks better on my screen than it does for you. So this is what's called a traditional S curve. It looks like an S on its side. And that's a very common way of adjusting these images with curves. Okay? So I have that traditional S curve, and that's reasonable for right now. Again, we'll get to the point where when we do some masking, we'll selectively apply a curve to just the sky, for example. And I'll show you how to do that. Okay? We can take this much, much further. If we go up to Layer, New Adjustment Layer, Curves, right? If I were to flatline it at the top and maybe almost invert it down here, there we go. Oh, there we go. See, we could take it way too far, right? So there's a lot of flexibility in terms of what we do and what we don't do. There we go. We'll pull that up and we'll pull that down. And we can create something that may or may not be attractive. Okay? But the point is there's a lot of flexibility in what's happening with the curve tool. And even some of the filters that happen as part of Photoshop work with the curve tool to create their custom looks. Okay? So again, that wasn't really what I was after. Let's go back to my traditional curve here. And that's the one that I liked a little bit better. Okay, so I've done curves. Now I'm going to move on, and I'm going to do something called pop. And the places where pop helps is when you have an image that has a lot of color in it, and you want to push the color values just a little bit. So something like this sunset would be a good example. And so I'm going to go up to and this, by the way, is written out right here under Photoshop 1.4. So again, everything we've gone through is all written out right here. The images are there that help you kind of walk through what's happening. Okay? So I'm going to go ahead and start by going to my Layer, New Adjustment Layer, and I'm going to go back to that Channel Mixer tool. And so we'll call this Pop. And I'll say OK. And so with the pop layer active here, I'm going to not check the monochrome box. I'm instead going to adjust some of these values. And I told you we'd get into adjusting these values. So under the output channel of red, I'm going to change the red value to 1/18, okay, which tints the whole image. If I took it further than that, obviously I can really push the red in the image. Okay? So let's just take it to 1/18. Now I also told you that the total should really equal 0. So I'm going to push that to 118, and then on the green and the blue, I'm going to do -9 and -9. And this is an arbitrary value. I could do 116, -8, -8. Right? The point is we're doing a little bit of math. And so in this case, I did 118, -9, and -9. Then I'm going to take the output channel and switch from red to green. I'll take the green value and put it at 118. And I'll take red and say -9 and -9. Then I'll go to the output channel blue, and I'll put the blue at 118, and the green at -9, and the red at -9. Okay? So effectively what I've done is on each of the color channels, the red, the green, and the blue, I've bumped the color itself up and decreased the opposite channel. Okay? And we can see, and on the projector it's really hard to see. Hopefully on your screens it will be far more obvious. What we've done is we've taken the image as it was and just pushed the color values just a little bit. We've pushed the saturation of the colors just a little bit in a very controlled way. And it can really bring out some of the better colors. If we combine that with the levels adjustment, we can get a really nice overall sunset image. And you can see it a little bit in the projector version of what's happening. So we've boosted those colors a little bit. It can be helpful on top of the pop to do a curves adjustment as well. So if I go to Layer, New Adjustment Layer, Curves, and then do a standard S-curve where I push this up just a little bit and pull that down just a little bit, that can help as well. And again, on the projector, it's starting to get too dark, but it looks a lot better on my screen with those combined. If you don't do the curves layer as part of the pop, it's OK. Right? You already did a curves adjustment in a little bit later, or a little bit earlier, excuse me. So that walks you through how to do the pop. So let me do that one more time on a different image. All right, let's go back to the this image. And this time you'll see it more in the blues rather than that. Let me turn off the curves adjustment, and we'll do this with nothing. I'm going to go to Layer, New Adjustment Layer, and I'm going to go to my channel mixer. I'll say OK, there it is. And I'll start with my red channel, and I'll go up, I don't know, 116. I'll go -8 and -8. Then I'll go to my green channel. That will be at 116. And the red would be -8. Oops, yeah. And then the blue would be -8. And then I'll switch to my blue channel. And this would again be 116, -8, and -8. Again, 116, 118, as long as the math works out, is fine. And so now we can take the image that it was before, and we beef the colors just a little bit. And we make them pop just a little bit more. It's really hard on the projector to see this happening. So hopefully as you do it, you can start to see that this makes a subtle but noticeable adjustment. Yeah?
What if we didn't do the sum to maybe 200?
So if it wasn't at 100, if it went up, you're going to end up skewing the color of the image as a whole. So let's say that I push this up, and it doesn't total, push it all the way, right? It doesn't total 100. The overall color of the image is now pushed on the blue side. So by keeping it at 100, we're keeping the general color tone of the image, and we're not shifting it toward green, blue, or red. It's a way of maintaining neutrality, but boosting the saturation of the individual colors. Okay? So that's why we try to keep it at 100. So, whoops, 116. Now, obviously, if it was close, right, say this was 118, we're at 102, we can't really tell that there's too much blue in the scene. Okay? But generally speaking, you want it to be there. And that's why it gives you the little triangle saying these really should equal 100, or you're going to skew the value. All right? So I've now done pop on that as well. Okay? So the next piece of this is something called dodging and burning. And in the world of dodging and burning, this goes back to old school. I'm in a photo lab and I'm developing something by hand. Okay? I'm pouring chemicals in a tray, and you guys have seen this probably on TV before, right? How many people have actually done it? Okay? At least one of you have done it. That's good. Okay? The point is that we can do the digital equivalent of pouring chemicals in a tray and adjusting our photo. Okay? And so what dodging and burning does is it selectively darkens and lightens pieces of the image. Okay? And so in order to do this, there's a very specific way that's a non-destructive way of doing dodging and burning. And you can dodge and burn your image directly, but if you screw it up, you can't go backwards. So I'd like to show you the way that lets you go backwards. And it's a little bit more complicated. So it's written out under Photoshop 1.5, and I'm going to go through that right now with you. So what I'll do is I'll start, and I'll go to Layer, but instead of going to an adjustment layer, this time I'm just going to go to a new layer. So it's Layer, New Layer. Okay? And when I get the new layer, I'm going to name it Dodge and Burn. And before I say OK, I'm going to come down to the bottom, and there's something called Mode. And this mode refers to something that's called a blending mode. We will spend a whole lecture talking about what blending modes are and how they work. But for right now, you just go to the mode, and we're going to change from normal to overlay. Okay, so we switch from normal to overlay, and then right below, this little checkbox shows up that says fill with an overlay neutral color of 50%. And we're going to check that box. Okay, so dodge and burn, mode is set to overlay. Check the box for fill with overlay neutral 50% gray. Once I have those three things set, I'll go ahead and say OK. And you'll see that unlike the other layers that I've been working with so far, this one looks different. Right? It's a gray box, and it says dodge and burn. I can now, assuming that I'm on this layer, which you see it's kind of highlighted in that lightish blue color, assuming that I'm on that layer, I can come over to my tools, and I can choose the dodge and burn tools. So if we look over here, it kind of looks like a pin. That's the dodge tool. I'm going to start, however, with the burn tool because I think it makes a more dramatic impact. So if I click and hold, just like I talked about, tools are hidden underneath other tools. I'm going to choose the burn tool, which is kind of like a little hand-looking thing. Okay? And with the burn tool selected, by default, my burn tool has a brush that's associated with it. For me, it's a 400 pixel brush, and I can see the circle of what that brush size would be. If yours is smaller, right, you can adjust the size by clicking on the brush and then dragging this slider. So for example, you see that my little circle is much smaller there. I can push that brush size up, and I can make it larger. I can push it up even higher and make it really big. Okay, I don't want it that big. I want it a little bit smaller. 400 was about right. And so now I'm at 400. So once I have the brush set up for the burn tool, when I move over, and I'm going to start with this upper area here, you see that I can start to darken up that part of the sky. See how that gets darker? Okay. I could move over here, and I could darken this corner a little bit. Right? I could move down in here, and I could darken up that a little bit. Right? And I can start to accentuate which parts of the image, where the darker parts would be, etc. And I could pick, which parts need to be dark. I can also take this a little too far. Right? Where I can turn something almost black. Right? See how those trees are almost black in comparison to those trees? The advantage here is if I go back to my dodge tool, which is the lightning, right, and I go back over the same area, I can eventually get it back to where I can see it to the way it was before. Okay? The dodge tool selectively lightens, and so I could go through and I could lighten up a particular piece. Now it is entirely possible the more times you do it, the more messed up you can get it. Okay? So if I switched back and I said, no, actually I want to bring that back, let me go to the burn, and let me do this again, all right, at some point it gets really hard to get it actually even without that halo effect. Okay? At which point I'd have to go back, create a new dodge and burn layer, and do it again. So let me turn that off, and I'll do that dodge and burn layer again. Actually, let me switch images. All right, I'll do this one now. Let me go to Layer, New, Adjustment Layer, or excuse me, Layer, New, Layer, Dodge and Burn. This is going to be Dodge and Burn 2. My mode is set to Overlay. I'm going to fill with 50% gray. I'll say OK. There's my Dodge and Burn. I want to use my Burn tool, and I want my brush to be a little bit larger. Maybe even a little larger. Yeah, that's about right. And then I'm going to just darken up a little bit of the pastry here, like that. Darken up the background a little bit. And just kind of accentuate that center part of the pastry. So if I were to turn off the Dodge and Burn, you can see that it does make a pretty dramatic difference, okay, in terms of what parts are dark and which parts are light. So I'll ask you to do some dodging and burning using this strategy on your images as well. Okay? So we've worked through all of these various adjustment layers. And now it's time to actually create your output and save your output. And remember, this is a pass, not pass class, so if something didn't really turn out right, that's OK. Or excuse me, this is a pass or not pass exercise. So if something doesn't turn out quite right, that's OK. Post it anyway. Okay? So now I need to go through and I need to save. And I'm going to do my saving through something called the Save for Web tool. And so I'll start with nothing on, and I'll go up to the File menu, and I'll go to Save for Web. I'd like to point out, though, if you work at home on, let's say you have the Creative Cloud, the Adobe Photoshop CC, if you have that on your laptop or whatever, the Save for Web is gone. It doesn't exist anymore. But it's really convenient for what we're trying to do, so we're going to use it in this class here. So with Save for Web, File, Save for Web, I'm going to change my format to be JPEG High under Preset. And I'm also going to adjust right here under Image Size. Whatever the bigger number is, I'm going to adjust that to 1,000. Okay, we don't need a particularly large image here. So I've adjusted the image size to 1,000. My preset is set at JPEG. And then I'll go ahead and click on the Save button. And when I click on the Save button, it's going to ask me where do I want to save this file. So let's go to my flash drive. Let me go, oops, wrong folder. Let me go into today's exercise, which is 104. Create a new folder for spring of 2017. And now I'm going to go ahead and add something to this file name. And so remember, a couple classes ago we talked about how to name your files, right? So this would be 135, and this would be lake image. And I'm going to add _original to it so that I know this is the original version. And again, that's going into this folder. I'll go ahead and click on Save, and now it's saved. Now I'm going to turn on my black and white layer. Okay, there it is in black and white. I'll go ahead and I'll go to File. Let me turn off the Dodge and Burn. Oops, that's already off. Let me turn off the channel mixer. I'm going to go to File, Save for Web. Same thing, JPEG High. My width is going to be 1,000. I'll go ahead and click on Save. Same name, except instead of original, it's going to be BW or black and white or something like that. And I'll click Save. Okay, so that's image number 2. Then we went on and we did levels. So let me turn on levels. You can choose to keep multiple things on, but at each step we need to save an image. So I have levels on. I'll go to File, Save for Web. Same thing, JPEG High, width of 1,000. I'll click Save. And this time it's going to be the levels. And I'll click Save. Then I moved on to my curves. So we'll turn on my curves. That one is awful. It was curves 2 that I liked. And I'll go to File, Save for Web, JPEG High, width is going to be 1,000. I'll click Save. And this is now going to be curves. I'll click Save. Now I have that. Then I did the pop adjustment, which I think was the channel mixer. There it is. And I'll go ahead and go to File, Save for Web. Same thing, 1000. Save. And this was pop. And I'll go ahead and click Save. And then the last one, right, was my dodging and burning, okay, which in this case turned out pretty awful, but such is life. Okay, so I'll go ahead and go to File, Save for Web. And we'll say that this is 1000. And I'll click Save. And I will call this DB for dodge and burn. And then I'll go ahead and save again. Okay, so what I ended up with was 6 total images for this image. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Okay, you will end up with 18 because you're doing this for 3 different images. Okay, you do the math, you get to 18. Okay, so now it's time to actually post it on the course website. And I am going to walk through this part of it because I want you to see this as well. So I'm going to go up to New and then Post. And this is going to be exercise 104. And I'm going to do a couple things differently. This, by the way, is written out, the steps that I'm going through, right? It was supposed to be written out on the back. You guys have a back on your thing? Gotta love it when they conveniently didn't copy the back, right? Anyway, sorry. OK, so we're going to do a few things differently. If you struggle with this, I'll help you through it. But instead of trying to show these as a bunch of individual images, we're going to try to do a slideshow where we show them all as a slideshow. That's why it's a little different. I apologize. The handout was supposed to have the instructions on the back for how to do this. OK, so what I'm going to do is I have exercise 104. Let me put my name here. And let me come down, and under categories, I'm going to make sure that I go ahead and say this is exercise 104, so that I'm basically ready to make my post. Then I'm going to, on the right side here, there's a tab called Format. And I'm going to go ahead and choose Gallery as my format. And when I choose Gallery as my format, I get a little toggle switch for Slideshow. So we're going to turn the slideshow on. It should be green. And then I'm going to click on Add Images to Post. And from here, I can actually bulk upload my images. So I'll click on Select Files. And let me go into today's folder. And I will select all of them. I'll click Open. And it will work through one after the other of all of these images. Okay? Obviously, if you have 18 images, and especially if everybody's doing it at the same time at the end of class, it's going to be a little slow. Okay? What else is new? Okay, but that went pretty fast. When I'm done, I'll click Save All Images. Okay? Then I'll go ahead and just close this. Right? So nothing actually showed up in the post itself, but I have the slideshow on. Okay? The last thing that I need to do is I have to pick my featured image again. It won't let you post without that. So I'll click on Set Featured Image. My images have already uploaded. Right? There they are as part of this. I'll go ahead and pick my favorite one, whatever that is. And I'll go ahead and set the featured image as that one. There it is. When I'm done, I'll go ahead and click Publish. Okay, so again, nothing actually shows up in the post, which is the weird part about this. Okay? But now that it's published, if I click on View Post, right, there they are in a nice little slideshow format that we can scroll through. Okay, that's the idea. If it doesn't work for you, if you need help, I'll obviously help you through it. I think what I will do is at about, we'll say in an hour, so at 10:40 or so, I'll do this again, and you guys can follow along with me once you have all your images. Make sense? Okay. So I'll turn you loose now to work on this stuff. Remember, you're shooting for 18 total images.